Welcome to the third Smart QA musings on methods. What's a method? Let's look at some examples of methods. I'm picking some that we encounter in typical engineering. For example, math, we see numerical methods. In civil engineering, we see finite element methods. In electronics, we see signal analysis. In electrical, we see electrical isolation methods. If you go into sociology, you see research methods, survey methodology. If you go to environment, you see environment impact assessment. All these are examples of some methods. What is common about this? Well, all these are about scientific inquiry. That's what it is. All these are about how to do the act of analysis of signal or figuring out the isolation or finite element analysis, how to do them in a very scientific fashion. So before we go any further, let's take a quick poll question. Let me share the poll. And the question really is, what do you think is a method? Is it techniques or principles? Is it processes or heuristics? Is it guidelines, heuristics, process, whatever? What do you think? Okay. Let's go back and ask the same question and kind of wrap this up a little, just to get a head around the method. So what's a method? It's really a discipline that deals with the principles and techniques of scientific inquiry. That's what the Merriam-Webster dictionary says about the definition of a method. There are many definitions. This is one that I thought was most apt. Now, some of the questions that pop is it a technique? Is it a process? Where do tools fit in? And what about experience? So when we talk about a method and we ask the question, it's important to kind of take cognizance and connect all these at some point, right? So let's step back a little and ask, how do we solve problems and what are the elements or components of problem-solving system? I'm sure we have heard many, many terms. The problem-solving system components seem to be like this, that's on the left. It could be, some people say it's philosophy. Some people, the problem-solving component is also culture, individual mindset, model, methodology, framework, techniques, process, tools, and checklists. I'm sure there may be a few more, but I think I have picked up the most commonly used ones, right? And therefore the question is, where do methods fit? What is a method here? Let's use this discussion to understand in a sense, what is when we started off with the definition of method as scientific inquiry, let's start with the methodology, model, framework, etc. So what does methodology, model, framework kind of indicate? They are a problem-solving system. So in code, we are more used to using the notion of framework, especially in software. Sometimes in architecture, in software, we use the idea of a model. Sometimes in software engineering process, we are used to a word called methodology. So the model, methodology, and framework could be stated as a problem-solving system. Whereas the details of how to go about it in a more structured scientific fashion is really by use of techniques or principles or guidelines. And these two together, therefore, form the notion of practice, which is what we kind of talked about in one of the earlier webcasts. So you really see methods to a large degree fit in here. Now let's talk about the rest of them and how do they connect. So now, given the picture of this doll, there is actually another doll sitting inside this doll. What does this mean? It means the context of the processes and the procedures, which are really the activities of how to do or activities to be done to solve, which represents a process, is what is the next after the practice. So do we need a process? Yes. Do we need a practice? Yes. Let's go dig in a little further. Now we have tools, templates, checklists. Some tools may be paper tools, some tools may be software tools or machine tools, and therefore these become aids to how to solve the problem. So now what we are trying to do is we are thinking of the notion of a practice that is enabled by a process which is helped or aided by a tool set. And where does the philosophy and mindset fit in? And that's the outermost piece. The notion of philosophy is an overarching worldview, whereas the culture and the mindset relates to the organizational environment and the individual's mentality. And therefore, it's all about people. So I have to get the idea that we have divided the entire problem-solving components, system components, into 4 buckets: the people, the practice, the process, and the tools. So where do methods really fit in? Largely, they fit in the practice. Right? What do we mean by that? It gives us a method of, it gives us a system of scientific inquiry. Right? So before we go any further, I have a quick question for you. Let's do a quick poll. And let me go into the next poll here. Back to the list. So the key to smart assurance, I mean, you can choose what's most appropriate because all seem to be closer. What do you think is the most key? Is it a method? Is it the process? Is it the tools? Is it the mindset? Is it the experience? What do you think is most apt? You can choose only one, unfortunately. So what do you think it is? Okay. So I think you say mindset. Maybe I'll differ with you, but I'll come back. Okay. What's important to understand is the key aspect is a mechanism of scientific inquiry before we get into the other aspects, which could be mindset at the topmost level, process at the next level, or tools. That's the lowest level, so to speak, right? Because one cannot use an aid or one cannot have a set of steps if the method of inquiry itself is not well formed. And that's why the method becomes very key to problem solving. And that is what makes it effective. Since we are talking about in the context of smart assurance, the focus is on, is there a well-formed method to assuring systems very well? And that's the context of smart assurance. We really want to do as minimally as possible, but accomplish a lot more. So the practice, which we briefly outlined as methodology or method, model, framework, aided by techniques and principles and guidelines, which actually give you the scientific inquiry, is really the practice, right? Now, guidelines can also be called as heuristics. Heuristics comes from experience, whereas techniques and principles comes from science and engineering. And model, methodology, and framework, which are all slightly different ways of the same idea called method, gives you the overall structure of how to go about it, right? And that really is probably the key aspect when it comes to a good problem solving. In this case, our solution, our problem solving is about how do I test really well. So when we have any system to solve any problem, and you say, here is a method, what should it satisfy? A problem-solving system should satisfy typically these outcomes. Is it effective? It should be consistent, efficient. It should be consistent. It should be scalable. It should be visible. That means I should be able to have measures to let me know where I am. It should be agile, that is responsive, and it should be leverageable. You might call it reusable if you like, right? And what we want is our system of problem solving. Ideally, we want it to satisfy all these outcomes. We want it to be effective, efficient, consistent, scalable, visible, agile, and leverageable, right? That's what we want. Now, how do these map to what we talked about? How do whatever that we talked about as in terms of people aspects, process aspect, practice aspect, tool aspects relate to these outcomes? I'm going to kind of connect these two. So when you look at effectiveness and efficiency, they are largely dependent on the individual practice and aided by tools. And remember, tools can be both software and hardware. Whereas the notion of consistency, that is irrespective of how different people do, and the ability to scale the act to a larger number of people, bigger product, and so on and so forth, is all about the process. And process always has certain measures, reports, charts to help us see where we are. And the process, if it's lightweight, can be deemed agile, which means it responds and we can constantly adapt. So these four, as you see, as consistency, scalability, visibility, and agility are all functions in a way of a good process. Whereas leverageability is all about tools. So maybe we have scripts which are automated, maybe we have smart checklists that we can come up with, any of those things which we can leverage. That means we don't have to start from scratch, are a function of tools. So where do the people stuff come in? Remember, you talked about mindset. They affect the larger context of everything. So the philosophy, the culture, and the organization have a deep effect on the individual's way of thinking and the mindset. And therefore, largely all these are impacted by the people aspects of problem-solving system, right? And that's really how these connect to the various outcomes. But remember, first, it is important to be effective, and then efficient. Then it's worthwhile. If you are consistent but not effective, it's not useful. If you're scalable and consistent but not efficient, it won't work. I guess you get the drift, right? Let's jump off into a slightly different way of looking at things. And I'm sure you recognize some of the actors. Dilip Kumar, Shah Rukh Khan, Shivaji Ganesh from Tamil. I guess you understand this jam. This is Hilary Swank. I'm sure you recognize Al Pacino, Marlon Brando. What do you think is common among these famous actors? And there are many more like these. The common thing is they all practiced what is called as method acting. So what do you mean by method acting? It's slightly different, but you get the idea. We'll talk about it in a second. What this meant was, if we talk about acting, and acting is just playing yourself. You are portraying the character using your personality, your natural personality. That's what we attempt to do. But then method acting is slightly different. It is about immersing oneself in the character to bring it to life. What do you mean by immersing yourself? For example, when Hilary Swank plays the role of a transgender in the movie that she was, she actually lived with transgenders. She actually lived a transgender life for some time to get into that. So most of these people, when they want to act that role, they try to become that person. I think in one of the actors spent many days in a hospital to understand what it is to be in a hospital and be a patient. So the idea of method acting is about being totally immersed into the character so that you can bring it to life, right? I just wanted to put this context in a slightly different note. This is not a technique, but this is basically a method from the context of immersion. But what it brings about is it brings about performances that are absolutely brilliant. So I've talked about methods from two slightly different contexts. I've talked about methods as a scientific inquiry And later, I've talked about a method as something that you deeply immerse, but both of them have the same outcomes, being able to do fantastic work. So methods are actually very key to being effective. And then comes process, and then later comes tools. And remember, testing is deep probing, as we talked about earlier. It is not just checking of code or validation of code at the end. And hence, a discipline that deals with the principles and techniques of scientific inquiry matters. I hope you get the idea that that is really the method. So the method matters to do deep probing. Thank you.